There are things a child finds that remain ordinary. A button in the soil. A marble. A coin rubbed smooth enough to have lost its face. And then there are things that seem to be looking back. The garden belonged to a council house in Hexham, in Northumberland, number 3, Reed Avenue. It was 1971, and one of the Robson boys was digging there when his hand closed around something small and hard. It was no larger than the middle of his palm. Soil sat in the rough hollows of its 2 eyes. Beneath them, a nose, a mouth, the suggestion of a human face pressed into something that looked like stone. He had found a head, and before long, his brother had found another. The boys were Colin and Leslie Robson. Later accounts differ over exactly what they were doing in the garden and how deeply the objects lay. The part that survives most clearly is this. Each boy was credited with finding one small head. One was soon described as male, and the other became an old woman, a hag, even a witch. Those were the names that people gave to the faces. Nobody could say what their maker had intended. They were only about 6 centimetres high, small enough to carry together in 2 hands. And once they were carried indoors, the story around them began to change. Members of the Robson household said the heads did not always remain as they'd been left. A face placed to one part of the room might later be found turned towards another. Later accounts added bottles and other objects thrown or broken. In the adjoining house, a child was said to have had their hair pulled while in bed. The disturbance had crossed the party wall. So had the story. The neighbour appears in the surviving accounts under more than one name. Sometimes Nellie, and sometimes Ellen Dodds, and sometimes just Dodds. And one night, she reportedly woke and saw a figure in a room. Now the descriptions, they shift. In one part, it was part man, part sheep. In another part man, part goat. But what remains consistent is the movement. It didn't attack her. It padded down the stairs, reached the front door, and left. Now, the quiet departure may be the strangest part of it. A creature capable of entering a house had behaved like a visitor who knew the way out. There's no independent evidence that such a creature was there. There was also a later suggestion that somebody had used a sheep's carcass in a prank. The surviving accounts do not settle what Mrs. Dodd saw or believed she saw. But by then, the 2 faces had acquired something that they had not possessed in the soil. A reputation. And reputation travels more easily than stone. By the autumn of 1971, the Heads had come to the attention of Roger Mickett, an archaeologist and a curator at the Newcastle's Museum of Antiquities. On the 29th of October, he wrote to Dr. Anne Ross. Ross was a serious scholar of Celtic, regional and ancient head imagery. Across northern England, carved stone heads had genuinely been found, some ancient and some difficult to date, many without secure archaeological context. Now, she'd spent years learning how such objects might fit into the beliefs of the people who made them. The Hexham pair arrived already carrying a mystery. In the museum and on the scholar's desk, they acquired measurements, drawings, correspondence and comparison. And that process matters. A crude face on a mantelpiece is curiosity. The same face drawn carefully to scale begins to look like evidence. And in March 1972, the Evening Chronicle ran a headline, "Terror from the Celtic Mists." Ross
publicly considered whether the garden might mark an early shrine or a burial place. No excavation followed. Nothing else was found beneath Reed Avenue to support it, but the possibility had been spoken aloud. And in 1973, Ross included the heads in an article called Some New Thoughts on Old Heads. She placed them among other carved heads from the region around Hadrian's Wall and described their archaic appearance. She also acknowledged the problem, that the objects had not come from a controlled archaeological dig. They'd come from two boys, through a family, out of the back garden, whose precise layers and fine conditions were unknown. Resemblance could place them beside an ancient object, but it couldn't make them ancient. So attention turned from the faces to the stuff beneath them. Professor Frank Hodson at Southampton examined the heads, and he described coarse sandstone, rounded grains held in calcite cement with a coating of lime, and traces that might have been pigment. The geological material, he suggested, could occur around Hexham. That sounded promising, but it still didn't provide a date.
Then a man named Desmond Craig entered the story. Craig had lived at number 3 Reed Avenue before the Robsons. He told the press that about 16 years earlier he'd made 3 little heads to amuse his daughter. He said he'd used local stone, sand and water, or mortar or cement depending upon the account. He'd left them in the garden, and he believed that one had been lost, 3 made, 2 found, and a former resident pointing to the exact patch of ground from which they had supposedly come. Craig made demonstration heads for the newspaper. They did not closely match the pair found by the boys, and that kept the argument alive. Yet, a man doesn't have to reproduce 16 years later every rough line of something he'd once made for a child. More importantly, Craig's account did not stand alone. Dr. Douglas Robson of Newcastle University removed a sample from one of the heads and he analysed it. His conclusion was direct. The material was artificial cement. It was unlike natural sandstone. That's the strongest material evidence in the case. Taken with Craig's former address, his timing, and his account of making the 3 heads, it makes modern manufacture substantially more likely than ancient Celtic origin. Now, it should have made the story smaller. Instead, the story grew. Anne Ross later said that while the heads were connected with her work in Southampton, she saw something inside her home, and her report reached the press in January 1974. She described a large creature, half human, half beast, which later retellings increasingly shaped it into a wolf-like figure. Her daughter was also later said to have seen a dark animal on the stairs. Ross connected these experiences to the heads. There's no physical evidence that the objects caused them, and this was not necessarily the kind of figure reported next door to the Robsons. A sheep-like or goat-like visitor in Hexham and a dark wolf-like presence in Southampton are 2 different accounts. Over time, they were drawn towards one another. Then, television gave them a face. On the 20th of February 1976, BBC Nationwide broadcast the story of the Hexham Heads to a national audience. Now, the programme had a problem that was familiar to television. People were describing a creature, but no camera had filmed one. So, the report supplied an image, and they used Oliver Reed in the 1961 Hammer film The Curse of the Werewolf. For viewers at home, uncertain testimony was suddenly accompanied by a fully formed monster. Fur, teeth, eyes, menace. The clip was an illustration. It was never evidence. But memory
does not always keep categories apart. After the broadcast, the Hexham creature became easier to picture and harder to separate from the werewolf that television had placed beside it. And the objects were changing too.
By the middle of the 1970s, there were two heads presented by the Robsons. There were the demonstration heads made by Craig. Contemporary reporting also said that Colin had made clay heads at school. There were scale drawings, photographs, and other carved heads used for comparison. More faces had entered the room, and with every new face, one question became more important. Which two were the originals? The museum record says that Mrs. Robson asked for her son's heads to be returned in March 1975. The following month, the museum director wrote that the tests were complete and that the objects had gone back to the Robsons and the file was closed. Later accounts placed heads in a box in Southampton during the same broad period. Both routes cannot describe one secure continuous chain without further explanation. None survives. That broken chain changes the scientific disagreements as well. Frank Hodson described coarse sandstone in calcite cement. Douglas Robson sampled artificial cement. Those findings conflict. They don't make the ancient and modern explanations equally strong. Local sandstone would never have proved ancient manufacture, while artificial cement points directly towards a modern object. But the contradiction leaves another possibility in the room. The two men may not have examined the same material. There's no surviving evidence strong enough to prove substitution. There's no secure object or sample available now to settle it. The uncertainty comes from the custody, not magic. In September 1977, the chemist and writer Don Robbins said he received a pair of heads. He was interested in the idea that stone might record and replay powerful human experience, the kind of theory popular culture had come to know as the stone tape. In February 1978, Robbins said he passed the heads down to a dowser named Frank Hyde, and Hyde is the last named custodian in the usual account. After that, the trail ends. Frank Hyde didn't vanish. The documentary connection to him did. And because copies and other heads were already circulating, we cannot now be certain that the objects he received were the pair lifted from the garden at Reed Avenue. We don't know where those objects are. We don't know whether either survives.
If an authenticated original appeared tomorrow, modern analysis might tell us what it was made from, and roughly how it had been manufactured. It could compare the material with Craig's recipe, and it might reveal whether different observers had handled different heads. But it could not tell us what moved in the Robsons' house. It could not tell us what Mrs. Dodd saw leave by the front door, and it could not decide what Anne Ross experienced on the stairs in Southampton. They belong to testimony, memory, and interpretation. The physical evidence points elsewhere.
Most likely, the Hexham Heads began as modern objects, small faces made from cement, possibly by Des Craig for his daughter, and then left in the ground long enough for the two children to find them. But finding them was only the beginning. In the Robsons' hands, they became disturbing. In a neighbour's account, they acquired a visitor. In a museum, they became evidence. In Anne Ross's work, they became ancient. In a laboratory, they became cement. And on television, they acquired a werewolf. And as copies, drawings and disputed pairs accumulated, they became impossible to follow.
The house on Reed Avenue didn't begin with too many heads. It began with two. The story made the rest. Giles signing off.